Okay. Hi everyone and welcome. My presentation today is about how we can leverage the current understanding of longevity medicine in order to incorporate nutrient therapies as an adjunct to our services, but in a way that's appropriate in our setting. I'll start with my disclosure. I'm a cosmetic physician and I manage 2 companies, and I have a financial interest in a practitioner's course and a patient program that I offer to clinics through BioAlly. So there's no doubt that there's an increasing demand for nutrient therapies in our setting. There's been a huge amount of research into longevity medicine and into the use of nutrients as therapeutics in that respect, and the findings are really, really exciting. I'll present some of them today. But the problem is the research is often misrepresented. So people are being guided by clever marketing rather than actual evidence. And while there is, because there really is no magic pill as it stands, but there are some really good evidence-based nutritional strategies that we can use to help manage the underlying mechanisms that are responsible for many of the presentations that we see in our setting. So they're the ones here listed here, these 4 here, that's what I'll focus on today. And I'll give you a general overview of what you can safely recommend in your practice to help improve patient outcomes. So these are some of the metabolic pathways that rely on nutrients, but this is just a really small part of the picture. Basically, every single cellular process in every cell in the body relies on macro and or micronutrients in one way or another. The general belief is that we can obtain all of the nutrients that we need from our diet, but according to a national survey, our diets only meet the nutritional needs of 5 nutrients, and up to 70% of the population are deficient in 1 or more of the remaining nutrients. So they're quite common. They're more common in conditions like obesity or celiac disease, and certainly more common in vegan diets or ketogenic diets, which are so popular at the moment. So you can expect that a certain percentage of our patients will have a nutritional deficiency, and they wouldn't even know about it because routine blood tests only assess for a handful of nutrients. But there are certain signs and symptoms that would point to an underlying deficiency. So these are some of the presentations that we commonly see in our practice, and we can manage them really effectively with topicals and devices and injectables, but we're only treating the surface because these are actually downstream effects of underlying inflammation, and inflammation comes with nutrient deficiencies. And we can expect that about 60% of our patients will have inflammation simply because that's the percentage of Australians who are overweight or obese, and that's an inflammatory disorder, and it can present with anything from acne to hirsutism to accelerated skin aging. Now, inflammaging is the term that's used to describe the connection between inflammation and aging, and it's been really well defined in the literature, but inflammatory conditions that accelerate aging can actually begin as early as childhood. And so basically even our younger patients may be aging at a rate that's faster than what they need to be. And while some of our treatments can help reduce the inflammation in the skin, we're not necessarily dealing with this underlying inflammation that places the patient at risk of various complications like delayed onset nodules or PIH. So what the research shows is that gut dysbiosis is largely responsible for this inflammation, and that's because 80% of all of the immune cells in our body are located along the length of the gastrointestinal tract, and our gut microbiota produces metabolites that communicate directly with these immune cells. Now, in a healthy gut microbial composition, that communication is an anti-inflammatory one, but in a dysbiotic composition, it actually causes inflammation, and inflammation can present with any of the symptoms and signs that we commonly see. And when it comes to aging, these are the hallmarks of aging, and they've been the focus of longevity research. And these are basically degenerative mechanisms that are interconnected through various signaling molecules, and they form this self-perpetuating cycle that begins and ends with inflammation. And with time, so what's clear is that mitochondrial changes and epigenetic changes actually begin as soon as our cells start to divide. And then with time, the systemic mechanisms develop. And an example of this is insulin resistance, which is an altered nutrient signaling, and that can occur in childhood. And then as we age, we have this cumulative damage to DNA and shortening of the telomeres, which then lead to the cellular mechanisms like senescence. And senescence is when our cells remain alive, but they no longer function. They just accumulate damage, and that triggers inflammation and perpetuates the whole cycle. So one way we can tackle the problem is to address the three mechanisms that occur earlier on, and in order to do that, we need to look at the microbiome. So I'll look at how this connection works and how it's relevant in our setting. Without a doubt, diet plays the greatest impact on the composition of our gut microbiota, and the composition can actually change from meal to meal depending on what we supply in the diet. Our beneficial microbial species rely on dietary fibre to survive. So what's been found is that a diet that's low in fibre reduces beneficial species and increases pathogenic ones, and with that comes a disruption in the microbial metabolites. So there's a reduction in beneficial short-chain fatty acids, which would normally support the gut wall and immune function, and there's an increase in endotoxin, which is a molecular pattern that's released from pathogens. Endotoxin then goes on to activate a molecule called zonulin, and zonulin is known to break down tight junctions between enterocytes and increase permeability of the gut wall. And this happens in anyone eating a Western diet. And what happens once it crosses the gut wall, endotoxin crosses the gut wall, and any contents of the gut lumen can cross through, they can initiate the innate and the adaptive immune cells that are located there, and that obviously leads to inflammation, which begins locally but can be transmitted distally to various organs. And it's through that through these inflammatory signals that also disrupt neuroendocrine and metabolic signals that gut dysbiosis can actually disrupt homeostasis in the skin. That's called the gut-skin connection, and acne is a really good example of this. I didn't move the slide across. But other conditions that can develop depend on genetic predisposition, which guides differentiation of T cells towards producing either an allergic, an autoimmune, or an inflammatory response. And all of these can coexist. So this is how dysbiosis and inflammation underlie some of the presentations that we see, and a Western diet is one of the main initiating factors. But fortunately, what's been found is that a diet that's high in fibre and polyphenols and omega-3 fatty acids can improve microbial composition and reduce inflammation, and that actually dampens the signals or the stimulus for the development of these genetic conditions. And that's actually an example of epigenetic regulation, which involves modifying factors outside of the gene in order to influence the expression of genes or our phenotype and even our appearance. This is a good example of what's possible with nutrients. In this experiment, researchers took pregnant mice who had a gene mutation that caused yellowing of the fur and obesity, and they gave them either their usual diet or one that was supplemented with nutrients that are known to influence the epigenome. And the supplemented mice had normal offspring despite them inheriting the mutation. So they concluded that the variations in appearance were actually due to differences or variations in the epigenome. And there are lots of studies that have now looked at various factors that can influence gene expression by either changing the microbiome, changing the cell environment, or actually producing direct modifications to DNA or to histones, which are proteins that surround DNA and they can influence which genes are switched on or switched off. So what that means is that even if we have a genetic predisposition for a certain condition, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will develop it. And obesity is a really good example of how diet and lifestyle can reprogram the epigenome. And it's also actually been found that inflammation can switch off longevity genes. So any inflammatory condition, including obesity, is actually a state of accelerated aging. These are some of the nutrients and the microbial metabolites that produce beneficial modifications to the epigenome. So again, the microbiome is relevant for this particular mechanism, and it's been found that microbial metabolites through epigenetic regulation can improve everything from immune function and metabolism to neurotransmitter synthesis and neuroplasticity and everything in between. So whereas a dysbiotic microbiome has been linked to various disordered phenotypes. So the type of diet that works for our genome or epigenome is one that works for the microbiome. So this is the last mechanism I'll look at, is mitochondrial function, and it's gained a huge amount of interest in longevity research, and that's thanks to findings like this. The mouse on the right had mitochondrial dysfunction induced 2 months earlier, and it rapidly developed wrinkles, hair loss, and a little bit of weight gain. And this is the same mouse 1 month after mitochondrial function was restored. So clearly this is mitochondria plays a crucial role in longevity. And that makes sense because mitochondria actually supply almost every cell in the body with energy in the form of ATP, and that allows the cell to function and repair and regenerate. And in the process, mitochondria produce free radicals, which also serve a beneficial purpose. So they activate our endogenous antioxidants to help scavenge the free radicals, but also activate enzymes that initiate recycling of damaged mitochondria and damaged cellular components, they're called mitophagy and autophagy, that process, which is essential for maintaining cellular homeostasis. So both ATP and free radicals need to be balanced in order to maintain that cellular homeostasis. These are some of the nutrients that support each part of the mitochondrial chain. And while the body can synthesize some of these to some extent, and the microbiome can supply the ones that are in the boxes here in red, we really largely depend on our diet, not just for these nutrients, but even for the substrates, so that we can synthesize these nutrients. So diet really is top priority when it comes to health. Now, if any part of that chain is disrupted through any of the mechanisms or factors listed here in the box, and these are modifiable factors, then energy production reduces, free radicals increase, our natural antioxidants become depleted, and free radicals are then free to damage DNA and other cellular components. And that's what's called oxidative stress. And with time, this can lead to mitochondrial dysfunction, which is actually the mechanism that underlies the symptom of fatigue and various fatigue syndromes. So these are some of the conditions that are linked to mitochondrial dysfunction. So you can see we can expect a certain percentage of our patients will have oxidative stress as a result of this particular mechanism. And in our setting, that's relevant because oxidative stress is linked to all of the aesthetic presentations that we see. And while there have been lab studies and rodent studies that have identified the different nutrients that help to support various aspects of skin health, and there have also been human studies that have linked nutrient deficiencies to certain conditions like psoriasis or atopic dermatitis, there isn't much good data that links the use of oral supplemental nutrients to measurable and objective benefits in the skin. And the ones here in red have shown some results, but nothing to get excited about. And if we just step back and look at the big picture, the reason why this could be the case is because the factors that damage the skin also damage other organs, and nutrients will preferentially go to other organs rather than the skin. And as you can see, there's a whole lot of nutrients that are needed to support these repair mechanisms. But studies will look at one or two, or at the most a handful of nutrients, and they use them for a limited period of time while the subject still continues to be exposed to all of the factors that contribute to inflammation and oxidative stress. So I think it would be good to see studies that take a more multifactorial approach. And this is actually just to give you an example of what's possible with a more comprehensive approach. Lipedema is a fat storage disorder. It affects 10% of women, so it's quite common and it's largely underdiagnosed. And it's caused by mitochondrial dysfunction in adipocyte, mainly in the legs and in the upper arms as well. And it leads to chronic inflammation and fibrosis and nodules and this progressive damage to vessels and lymphatics. And until recently, it was believed that it's completely resistant to diets. But there are now there's good published data and protocols that are actually producing results through the use of a combination of long-term dietary and supplemental interventions, ones that are specifically known to help improve dysbiosis, inflammation, and oxidative stress. So given that these are the same mechanisms that underlie various skin presentations, it's possible that with a more multifactorial approach, there may be some measurable benefits there too. So these are some of the nutritional interventions that have been shown to improve microbial composition and reduce inflammation and oxidative stress. And without a doubt, diet is the top priority, and the recommendations that I've listed here are safe to make across the board. I think with the exception of food allergies, there would be very few people who have contraindications to these recommendations. So take photos, print it out and hand it out to your patients. But beyond this, you really want to personalise diets, especially for those who have specific dermatological conditions, because everyone responds differently to different food components and nutrients and different dietary interventions. So I'll give you an example. So if someone is seeing, if you're doing PRP for alopecia, you wouldn't want to be recommending a ketogenic diet or intermittent fasting, because that can disrupt thyroid hormones and that will just worsen the alopecia. So there are lots of factors that need to be taken into consideration. But these recommendations are safe to make across the board. And when the diet is optimized, then there are some supplements that can really make a difference. But I think without the diet, supplements are just a band-aid. They will provide some short-term benefits, but the diet is the first priority. And that brings me to the other thing, other issues with supplements. The industry is very poorly regulated. The vast majority of supplements are food grade. They rarely contain any active ingredients in therapeutic doses, but they contain a large amount of excipients. And a common one is maltodextrin, and that's known to cause dysbiosis and inflammation. So just be aware of that. And also, they're not without risk. So high doses or prolonged use can cause various side effects. Certain supplements can interact with medications or worsen certain medical conditions. So ideally, you want to look for high quality TGA listed products, but just be aware that they don't need to list excipients on their labels. And I'm yet to see one that doesn't contain excipients, so always check with the manufacturer. So I'll just quickly finish up with some points on nutrient infusions. We know they're becoming increasingly popular. They've been used in integrative settings for many years to help with symptoms of fatigue syndromes and infections and even addictions, and they're now becoming increasingly popular and marketed for longevity or as energy boosters. And one of the reasons why they're so widely available is simply because compounded infusions have been exempt from TGA regulation for over 30 years. But with the exception of vitamin C potentially improving aspects of immune function, there isn't any good evidence for the claims that are being made. And they're high-risk interventions. So there have been a lot of complications reported ranging from infections to death. So patients really do need to be under the care of an experienced practitioner who knows how to assess them thoroughly, who knows how to individualise the protocols and monitor the patients as well. But that's not how they're really being managed in the IV clinics that are the main providers now. And just to finish up, so the practice itself isn't going unnoticed. This is a complaint submitted to the TGA that highlighted the false claims being made, the lack of assessment and supervision, and the inexperience of the providers and prescribers. So concerns are being raised. And I think as aesthetic practitioners, we really need to think about what we're treating, because we're not treating fatigue syndromes, we're not treating addictions. And we need to look at what's the safest and most appropriate option given our level of experience. So thank you. I hope now when you go back to your clinics, you'll be able to recognise or identify the patients who may benefit from nutrient therapies, and you now have a better idea of what's safe, what you can safely recommend as an adjunct to your services to improve patient outcomes. Thank you.